Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much to Matthew for that introduction. It's not often that people say that they welcome having politicians as speakers, so that's a plus point as an introduction to start off with. I'm like Matthew, I'm afraid I'm not offering any cuddles. I probably have to declare them in the register of MPs' interest in the House of Commons, so I'm not going to do that one. But thank you for the hashtag. I am on Twitter. And I will be tweeting on the train on the way back to London today. I'm also hoping that my voice is going to hold out. So if I suddenly burst into a bout of coughing, then somebody will have to ask an instant question. So I hope you've all got questions that you're thinking of as I'm speaking, because there's a good opportunity for questions, and I really appreciate hearing your thoughts on the sector and the issues challenging and facing your universities at the end of this session. As Matthew said, I'm the Member of Parliament for Loughborough. Obviously, Loughborough having its own rather large and obviously highly successful, not that I'm in any way partisan, but I'm here to fly the flag always for Loughborough University. I think we've got a couple of people from Loughborough here in the audience this morning, and if they could perhaps wave their arms just so I know where to avoid looking. There we are, so down there on the left. So I'll focus over here, ladies. So, but you can report back to the Vice-Chancellor afterwards whether I said the right things about the university. And I am also the Parliamentary Private Secretary to David Willetts, who is the Minister for Universities and Science. David is, he sits in the Cabinet, but he's not a member of Cabinet. And I'll come on to explain what a PPS actually does in a moment. When I talk about universities this morning, I'm really using that as shorthand for sort of all higher education institutions. That probably doesn't apply to everything I'm going to say, because there'll be times when I probably should draw a distinction between colleges and offering HE and other private providers, but I'll use the phrase university, so forgive me for those of you who know the sector better than I do if sometimes the language isn't quite right. I think the important point to bear in mind is that higher education changes lives. It is the biggest driver of social mobility we have in this country. People with higher education qualifications are still more likely to be in work and are less likely to be unemployed, and we know there's a graduate premium. So this government is, like I'm sure all previous governments, committed to making sure that the brightest and the best go to universities, and that those universities are put on a sustainable, particularly funding footing, but also recognising the importance of things like teaching, which is absolutely critical to the student experience. And I'm going to come on to talk about the white paper in a moment. So what I'm going to talk about is about representing a university in Parliament, because obviously that is a huge, I wouldn't say it's not the biggest part of my caseload by any stretch of imagination, but Loughborough University, for those of you who know Loughborough, is a large university in a relatively small town, so it has an impact. And I hope there might be some insights I can just give you as a Member of Parliament representing a university. I'm going to talk to you about what a PPS actually does, because I have to say, until I got the phone call from David in September 2010, he said, would you like to be my PPS? I didn't have a clue. I had to go away and do Google search, quickly look up what does a PPS actually do, because I'd never worked in politics before I was elected 2 years ago. I was a solicitor working in London before I was elected. I'm going to talk about the relationship between students and where they study. Both from the perspective of having been a student myself and obviously still having links to my university, but also I can see the long-term links that develop between my local students and their university. And then talking about students at the heart of our higher education system. So representing a university. All of you will have members of Parliament representing your universities, and I hope that you know them well and that you make good use of them, because members of Parliament are there to be advocates for all of their constituents. That includes people who work in the constituency but may not live there, or people who are living there temporarily, as students do. Matthew mentioned the impact of national policy, and obviously national policy is very much affecting the university and higher education sector at the moment. I'm not sure if this is in a way that it never has done before, but I certainly think it's the time when we've had discussions in Parliament, and no doubt we will do so again in the future, that you want to make sure that your members of Parliament are well briefed on how national policy is impacting on your university, and particularly in the area of funding, obviously. I get quite regular updates from my Vice-Chancellor and from other members of Loughborough University, and also Loughborough College, I should say, because I have an excellent college as well, further education college, delivering higher education. They work closely with Loughborough University and other nearby universities as well. And it's very interesting hearing, obviously, how the funding changes are impacting on their plans. but also recognising the place of universities in our local economies. I hadn't really appreciated until I was elected quite what a significant impact the university had on our local economy. Obviously in terms of employment, and that's something that you're very much focused on. I think Loughborough University is now the largest employer in the local area. We, unfortunately, AstraZeneca, which had a large plant in Loughborough, closed their doors finally at the end of December last year. So Loughborough University, a very significant employer. But also the recipient as a university of lots and lots of funding from other sources. And again, I hadn't really appreciated until I was elected, for example, how much interaction the university had with organisations like the regional development agencies. Now, obviously, the RDAs have gone, but the university, certainly Loughborough, is now very involved in the local enterprise partnership. In fact, Loughborough doesn't have a place on the board, but Leicester University does. And I think it's absolutely critical, and I'll come on to talk about university business links. I think it's absolutely critical that universities are really plugged into the local business economy as well. In respect of the impact on residents, and obviously, as I said, Loughborough University is a large university, and it expanded pretty rapidly over the past, certainly sort of, I would say 10 to 15 years. And that meant that a lot of students couldn't be accommodated on campus. So many of them wanted to live out. Once you've lived on campus for your first year, then part of the student experience is moving out and living out in the community. But obviously that brings with it knock-on effects to the longer-term residents and people who've been living in a town like Loughborough for a long time. So I certainly have quite a lot of casework, or had quite a lot of casework in terms of dealing with obviously some student-resident relationships, and also some of the behaviours. Students have a different lifestyle, obviously, from residents, and different times of the day when they'll be going out, and often it's just as simple as encouraging people to have conversations. I have to say that Loughborough University, once they had, I think, recognised the problem, have appointed a terrific community liaison officer, and you may have a similar person within your organisation, and she is a fantastic contact person for residents with any queries, and she will go away and she sorts it out. And interestingly now, in terms of the impact of national policy, what we're finding is Loughborough have built a lot of on-campus accommodation, so a lot more people living back in student halls, and that's having a knock-on effect on the housing market locally in Loughborough. And so I'm now working with residents to see if we are able to develop a strategy for reutilising some of the houses that used to be let to students to be let to families, because there's obviously a demand for family accommodation and a shortage of social housing. I should also say, though, that students spend money. They are a critical part, a bit like the university, but a different part of the university in terms of their impact on the local economy. And so we should never forget, and I don't think my local council and I don't forget, certainly in terms of when you're designing a town centre and a retail offering and all sorts of other attractions, that students will spend money and going out socialising. They are an absolutely critical part of our local economy. They also organise fantastic social action. Again, I'm sure probably all your universities have examples where your students are delivering social action projects. They're going out, we have an action project, and in fact they've just organised a fantastic community fun day. Last week they organised a tea dance for elderly residents. They organised an international day, which the mayor actually was talking about, the retiring mayor on Monday night. He was saying he's just done 12 months. The only thing he turned down in 12 months was the opportunity to eat a worm at the International Day event. I'm not quite sure which nationality was offering worms, but if anybody knows, they can tell me afterwards. But that was just one challenge too far. And it's important that students get a good impression of Loughborough. We want them to go away and be advocates for Loughborough post when they leave, and some of them will stay locally. But when they go away, we want them to go away and say what a fantastic experience they had while they were living in Loughborough. And that applies to obviously overseas students as much as it applies to those coming from home. And one of the other examples, I don't know if we've got anybody here from Montfort University, but I know that Montfort have got their Square Mile project. And again, that's a fantastic example of the university and students working with the local community. Now, Matthew mentioned that there was an Olympic theme to this year's UHR conference. You couldn't get more Olympic than Loughborough University, the home of Team GB, and all our Team GB athletes are going to come through Loughborough to pick up their kit. But how does that impact me as a Member of Parliament? Well, on Monday morning, I found myself on BBC Radio Leicester explaining the impact of the fact that Team Japan had decided to have fewer athletes based at Loughborough University. Often are going to come straight into London accommodation. So I will often find myself rung up by the local media and asked to comment on a story, which is basically a university story, but they will ask me, partly because I'm the PPS to David, but often just because I'm the local Member of Parliament. So going back to my first point on this slide, which is about Members of Parliament like to know what's going on locally. If you've got something that affects you as a university, whether it might be staff redundancies, staff changes, changes to funding, then it's better to brief your Member of Parliament than find them unbriefed when they go on the local media or asking questions about the university. What does a Parliamentary Private Secretary do? Well, our basic role is to be a liaison between ministers or the minister that we work for and backbench members of Parliament, probably on our own side of the House, but that doesn't stop members of Parliament from the opposite side of the House from asking us to raise an issue with the relevant minister. Now, David is Minister for both universities and also for science, and so I mentioned earlier on the closure of AstraZeneca. Anybody here has university access or university impact by pharmaceutical companies and drugs research will know that the pharma sector is changing, and I often get a number of MPs from across the House wanting to talk to David about those sorts of areas, science, research funding, as well as university policy. PPSs are not necessarily meant to spend time in the relevant department. We are not civil servants. We don't work in the Minister's private office. We don't run his diary, although we can obviously make requests in all those sorts of ways. And I do get to see David's diary, so I do know who's meeting, and when he has gaps available for other meetings. We don't necessarily get a chance to influence policy. Obviously, we can pass things on, obviously Loughborough University and College we're very pleased to have their Member of Parliament appointed as PPS to the Universities Minister, because it does mean that I can feed often the Vice-Chancellors and the Principal's thoughts straight into David about the way that national policy is impacting. But we don't get a chance to necessarily input into policy or to know what's coming up. We have duties in the House of Commons, formal duties. If you'll see somebody sitting behind a minister in the House of Commons, they usually have their PPS sitting behind them, and our job is to scurry to get notes from the civil servants when the minister is speaking and to pass those to the minister and backwards and forwards. That certainly brings you down to earth. If you think you have any influence over anything, then you ought to try being basically a note carrier. And that reminds you of your place in the world very, very firmly. The Ministerial Code does apply to us, and that means that we are expected to vote with the government in all divisions, and if we cannot vote with the government, then we are expected to resign. Sadly, we don't get paid a ministerial salary. In fact, we are members of the government, but unpaid members of the government. But it is often regarded as being a first rung on a ladder. But who knows, whether that's entirely true. It does give you access, obviously, to how ministerial offices work and how ministerial responsibilities work. So it is very interesting from that point of view. In terms of dealing with organisations outside Westminster, I will obviously get asked to meet quite a lot of universities or different university bodies, and it's a mixture. It is completely I think, up to the PPS how they want to do it. Some will say, no, my role is basically to work with the Minister and liaise between members of Parliament. I'm actually, obviously, before I was elected, before I was appointed to be David's PPS, I was actually on the Business Innovation and Skills Select Committee, which also looks at higher education policy. So I was already interested in higher education, so I often will meet external facing organisations, and I will pass that information on to David if there's a particular point, or to his special advisor if there's a particular point that's being made about policy, just feeding it all in, really. I think intelligence about how things are working on the ground is absolutely invaluable to ministers and to their advisors. It's very easy to publish a policy and to think that's it. I think ministers in this government are very focused on implementation of policies, but it's still hard sometimes to judge exactly what's happening on the ground. And often you only hear from one particular sector if they've got a problem with something. And sometimes it's nice to hear, actually, this is working, or it's working, but it would work even better if you did this. So that sort of feedback is invaluable. And obviously, again, it goes back to my point on my first slide about using your local Member of Parliament to pass that intelligence on. So moving on to national policy, putting students at the heart of the higher education system. I suppose the first challenge in terms of higher education facing the government when we came into power was the impending publication of the Brown Review, which was published in October 2010. It was set up by Lord Mandelson when he was head of the Business, Innovation and Skills Department, and its aims very much to put higher education on a sustainable funding footing. And obviously there was a lot of debate at the time about a fees and loan system versus a graduate tax. But the ultimate recommendation from Brown was that graduates should pay more towards the education that they had received. Clearly, we also came into government at a time when there was less public money around, so we had a decision about either cutting the numbers of people going to university, and there are people who will advocate that. I have a number of constituents who will tell me there are too many people going to university, or we could cut the amount spent per student, or we could increase the money going via students paid for by upfront loans. I'm sure I don't need to rehearse for you exactly the way the funding system is working, but it was one of the big sort of PR battles, was obviously explaining to people how the new system was going to work, and the fact that it was about everything being covered by loans. If you were a first-time undergraduate, you would get that loan and it would pay for your fees. The timing was an issue. I was asked to be David's PPS in September 2010 because of my work on the Business Committee and also my interest in Loughborough. I knew that the Brown Review was forthcoming, but it was a bit of a roller coaster ride to get from September 2010 to December 2010 when the vote happened. And I think probably my busiest period running around getting views from obviously all sides of the House, but particularly coalition members of Parliament about the whole fees debate. And the timing was really driven in terms of the vote in December 2010, because I know that universities needed to print their prospectus. They needed to know, have certainty about the funding, and that was a real driver. And I think in a way it was difficult dealing with funding before we dealt with the issues that were then raised in the white paper, which were much more about a vision for the sector going forward. Focusing just on money meant that people have very much associated higher education reform and the coalition government's policies with funding, with tuition fees, which I think is not helpful, because there is a much wider policy angle too. But anyway, the vote was passed in December 2010, and obviously we are now going to see the impact of those changes from this September, and I know that as a sector everyone's been very busy preparing for the changes. HEFCE in February this year announced the sector level funding totals for the academic year 2012 and 13, and it is right that the total recurrent teaching grant has been cut. And that the mainstream teaching grant has fallen from 3.6 billion to 2.4 billion. But support for widening participation, I'll come on to talk about that, and improving retention are broadly maintained. And there's a small increase in other target allocations, which is due to new interim supplements for postgraduates on higher cost courses and London waiting. HEFCE does point out, though, that the total value of resources available to institutions after the fee income is included is expected to increase in cash terms. And wider variations are expected, obviously, at the level of individual institutions, and also there will be changes resulting from the new core and margin model, which is likely to mean a small shift in resources away from higher education institutions overall and towards further education colleges, who are often charging lower fees. However, funding for university teaching is expected to grow by 10% over this Parliament, and although the central HEFCE grant is falling, more money will reach institutions as resources follow the decisions made by students. And that last phrase, decisions made by students, is absolutely critical in understanding, I think, the policy I'm going to come on to. The Higher Education Funding Council figures for England show the funding for university teaching will go up from 8.9 billion this year to 9.1 billion next year and 9.6 billion the year after. But the money is coming through the fees and loans, not fees students have to pay up front, to ensure that we have strong, effective universities that can continue to educate many students. Now, where is the new funding going to go? And this may be something that you want to ask about or to discuss in questions. And I was reading last night the Universities UK recent report on how universities are using income from variable fees. Now, obviously, there's been a lot spent on staff, but there's lots of other areas as well. They were talking in the UK report about buildings and facilities and services, all of which I think are designed to enhance the student experience. So the white paper was published in June 2011, and the government's vision was very much about putting higher education back on a sustainable financial footing, which obviously been tackled the previous December, but it was also about putting students at the heart of the system, and that was the name of the white paper, improving the academic experience within universities and colleges and making them more accountable to students than ever before. It was also about taking steps to improve social mobility without compromising academic excellence or institutional autonomy. And that's a battle and a conversation that I've had with many of my fellow Conservative backbench MPs, and I'll talk about autonomy a little bit later. We wanted a simpler, more flexible system which gives students better value and greater choice. And that means a more diverse range of providers should be able to play a role. It means funding for teaching should follow the choices that students make, and it means empowering students to make their own choices based on better and more transparent information. And that's why on the slide I put about well-informed students driving teaching excellence. And I've mentioned at one of the websites there may be others, and I think this has come very much from perhaps the school sector, but there is now an opportunity for students to give a lot of feedback on the performance of academic staff, and I'm guessing, again, might be something you want to touch on in questions, but that's something that you as HR professionals have to deal with. Something that people may not be used to is getting that very direct feedback. I have yet to meet, certainly at schools, but also at student level, people who aren't direct when they're giving feedback or asking, certainly me, questions. And I suspect that on the websites, people don't hold back sometimes about what they say about the teaching experiences that they've received, and that's something that has to be managed. So the quality of teaching is going to be focused on like never before. And I think the teaching mission of colleges and universities has sometimes been overshadowed by the importance of research. And so I think as we're asking students to invest more in their personal futures, that's why there's going to be a greater focus on the educational experience that is provided to our students. Universities are also going to be encouraged to produce student charters to set out what universities will provide and what's expected of students in return. You know, this is a two-way process. I think it's very clear that is going to be made clear. And the suggested list of items for charters includes essential course costs and estimate of additional costs, and charters are to be jointly developed, we expect, between and agreed with local students' unions. The emphasis is going to remain firmly on improving teaching, but on new and innovative ways of organising undergraduate courses, making sure that all applicants can see essential information about contact time, work experience opportunities, subsequent employability data and the like on universities' websites. And we are intent on seeing the sector modernise and also achieving greater operational efficiency. And Matthew mentioned the Diamond Review in his opening remarks, recognising that we do have world-class institutions. And we've got a broader mission for universities. Universities add value. It's not all about employability. It's more than just fitting in with our financial constraints. We are financially constrained within the public sector very much at the moment, but universities are about more than just the finances. So will there be a continued increase in teaching-only contracts? That's something you might have a view on. Will more staff be employed to enhance other areas, things like career services and libraries and other things that add to the overall student experience? And then at the bottom of the slide, I put the global market. According to the Times Hire, we've got 32 of the top 200 universities in the world, but there's a lot of competition. There are a lot of universities coming up on us fast, and we've got to make sure that we are still best placed to attract students from overseas. People want to come here. But also recognising that we have students who will often want to go and study overseas. And whilst that may be a blow to home universities, that's not necessarily a bad thing in terms of both language abilities, but also in terms of encouraging students to see the wider world. But it may be they study abroad as part of longer degrees with sandwich courses where people go and study overseas. I mentioned core and margin earlier on, and obviously this is one of the areas that I think is causing the greatest level of scrutiny, certainly by the sector as they work out how it's going to work. We do want to introduce and have introduced more flexibility, and we want to free up centralised number controls. There will be an impact on universities as the grade level changes, and obviously we recently announced last month that the grades were going to change downwards from AB to ABB. And that's going to free up many more places from those overall centralised number controls. The white paper also touches on the impact of more private providers. We think that it is healthy to have a vibrant private sector working alongside our more traditional universities. And so we want to, in the white paper, we talk about removing the regulatory barriers that prevent a level playing field for higher education providers of all types including further education colleges and other alternative providers. And we think this is going to further improve student choice by supporting a more diverse sector with more opportunities for part-time or accelerated courses, sandwich courses, distance learning and higher level vocational study. So we want to make it easier for new providers to enter the sector, and in the white paper we touch on making it easier for the obtaining and renewing of degree awarding powers and also reviewing the use of the title university. But you may have a view, and I'm sure you will, as those working with HRs in HR, on whether more private providers are going to, whether that's going to impact on staff paying conditions. What's that going to do to contracts? What's that going to do to pensions? Collaborations, alliances and mergers. As I've mentioned, there's a lot of scope for savings within institutions through better procurement, outsourcing the use of shared services. There's also scope for much greater transparency about costs, not least so students can know how their fees are being spent and how effectively. Adaptive and sustainable institutions are essential to an effective higher education system that meets the needs of students, the economy and society. And we are at a time of change as well as opportunity, and many institutions are considering their role, their market position, their structure and their partnerships. And for some, this may raise questions about the pros and cons of collaborations, alliances and mergers. It's all happening around the world. It's happening in Wales in particular. In England, we probably need to think about it. I should stress there is no question of a top-down approach. The government believes that any changes like this might well be part of the sector's response to the changing environment. But this is very much a matter for institutions. There is going to be no top-down influence on whether there will be a growth in collaborations, alliances and mergers. I thought it was worth touching on visas and UK border agency because I suspect you'll have views and questions on that in terms of the recruitment of both staff and also from students. The government does recognise the university concerns about the outcome of the recent consultational student migration system. And I can assure you that David Willetts is working very closely with Damien Green at the Home Office. And we have got to recognise, as I said earlier on, that our universities operate in a global market. One of the issues is the fact that students count as migrants for the purposes of the definition that we currently use. And yet, if you were to ask, I suspect, my constituents who feel very strongly about levels of immigration, whether they want to restrict the numbers of, say, Chinese students coming to Loughborough, they would look at me as if I was completely mad. So it is a tough balance to strike because people and the public definitely want to see overall immigration coming down. There is definitely need to make sure that people in this country obviously are able to get the jobs available, but we also need to recognise, particularly our university sector, we're operating in a global market, and we must have the freedom to attract both staff and students from overseas without making life too difficult from them. So ministers are continuing to work with the UKBA and with universities on removing obstacles to the essential business of global intellectual exchange. And the government's launched a new cross-department venture called the HE Global Integrated Advisory Service, which aims to bolster the competitiveness of UK institutions in the increasingly crowded global education market. And the idea is it's going to collect together in one place the advice and services offered by the Foreign Office, the Biz Department and UKTI, as well as the British Council, and make that available to universities. Now, the relationship between students and where they study, and never forgotten, I was slightly flippant when I said this, because I mean, obviously people talk about their university relationships, and the friends that you make in your first week of university are often the ones that you spend the rest of your 3 years trying to lose. But I think the relationship between where people study and the impact it has on their lives going forward is absolutely critical. It starts obviously with applying to a university, and schools and teachers are absolutely essential in terms of the influence they have on the students, plus obviously parents, but a lot of parents will rely on teachers and schools to give advice on where pupils might want to go to university and what they might want to study. And I think it's been recognised that our careers advice, and again, welcome your thoughts on this, yeah, I know that, I mean, David will say he's been to schools and people have said, oh, I want to study X, but they're doing completely the wrong A-levels. And nobody's ever said that to them, if you want to do medicine or science, this is what you probably need to be doing at A-level. And so we have got to go back. There is a relationship, an important relationship between schools and universities in terms of advising students about the best subjects they should be studying at an early stage to get on to their degrees. And last month, the government launched the new National Careers Service, which is absolutely critical in terms of making sure that people of all ages, and it's an all-age career service. In terms of location, where will students study? You know, there is an argument to say that perhaps some students will want to study closer to home in terms of being able to save living costs. I suspect that may be a temporary phenomenon, if it's happening at all, because people will still want to look at the best university for them and the best course for what they want to do later in life. Part-time study is very important. I think it's obviously going to grow, and the government reforms for the first time offered loans to people studying part-time, and I know that was welcomed by those operating that part of the sector. I think we should also recognise there are other options, I mentioned before about the option of cutting the number of people going to university. That's certainly not something that the government wants to see, but there needs to be a recognition that there are other options for people leaving school, obviously going straight into the world of work, and also apprenticeships are two of the options. But also recognising a lot of people will come out the other side of those things and then want to go and study later on. And I think we need to make it, and it is being made easier for people to think, actually, it's a lifelong learning journey. It's not just all about the decisions that you make when you're 17 or 18. I mentioned earlier on about the key information sets, and I think this is a critical part of the relationship, the early relationship, that and the employability statements between students and universities. And it's the first link that people have to information they're going to get to universities, and they will judge, I think, often the university on the type of information they get and the impression that they get of the university from that. And we need to think about why people go to university. Getting a job is still the highest reason, or having employability skills, but there are also broad reasons as well about why students will want to go to university. Finally, about building up long-term links. As I say, I think we underestimate the links that people have with their university going forward. If it's somewhere that, and we firmly believe that for most people going to university is that life-changing experience, that driver of social mobility, then they want to retain links. Or alternatively, and I will come on to this, if people operate a business near a university, then they want to have links with that university. Many people will stay, obviously, in the region where they studied and will take up employment. We haven't said much about research, but clearly a number of students will stay on as postgraduate students, or they might come back to study later on, because research will draw them back into universities. There is a critical role in the business department plan for growth, and we're all wanting to see growth in the economy. University research, and I'm very keen to see universities tied into delivering that growth and the impact that the research side of universities and the many other avenues in which universities are tied into our local, regional and national economy, recognised in the delivery of growth. The university industry collaboration links with businesses. I think this is vital. I'm currently doing what's called an Industry and Parliament Trust Fellowship. This is an organisation designed to build links between industry and parliamentarians on manufacturing. And I've been spending quite a lot of time at Cambridge University talking to the Institute for Manufacturing, but also I know from my links with Loughborough and going around there that they have a lot of links with local businesses. I mentioned the LEPs earlier on, but obviously things like sandwich courses, the involvement of employers. The white paper also talked about employer-sponsored courses, and I think that's something, certainly Loughborough has a very well-established collaboration with Balfour Beatty, and I think that academic staff working with industry on teaching, particularly with the emphasis on graduate employment, is going to be key. And finally, obviously, alumni organisations. I think, again, universities, in my experience, the contact from my old university, they've got a lot better about contacting me in recent years and telling me what's going on at the university. Of course, there are always an appeal, a financial appeal at the end of it, but that's to be expected. And I don't mind, and it's nice to see the money turning up and being used in building new buildings or libraries, as it was in the case of my college. But I think it is very important that universities do have their links with their former students. It's also about expertise and about contacts and having the right people to ask if issues should arise. So I hope that's given you a flavour of the perspective from government of national policy, of a local member of parliament's perspective on representing a university, and also what I do in the role as PPS to the Minister for Universities and Science. Thank you very much for your patient attention. I'm very happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Squeeze behind you, please.
gentleman down here.
Hello, I'm Mike Moore from the University of East London, and I'm the HR Director there and Acting Director of Student Services, and I recently attended the UK conference on government policy in relation to student control of numbers coming in terms of being able to study in the UK, and there was a general concern that only 3% of the students wish to stay on after completing their course of study in the UK, and therefore there isn't really an issue about students abusing our immigration system. So I was pleased to hear about David Willetts having a dialogue with the Home Office about that major problem for UK universities, because we're being deprived of potential major income, but also, in a way, more importantly, major relationships and a profile of the UK internationally through restriction on student numbers, and that we're losing a lot of potential staff and students to other countries. And do you think that the government are now awake to that notion fully, and that they're going to be actively addressing the problem, both in terms of international staff recruitment, but also student numbers as well?
I think they're certainly very aware of it, and the Biz Department, I think, would be listening to your, well, you know, I should take that back, but listening to your remarks would absolutely understand where you're coming from, and the Home Office is also very aware of the concerns. The Prime Minister is very aware of the issues. My colleague Jo Johnson, who's PPS2 on the other Biz Ministers, wrote an article in the Financial Times on Tuesday talking about this issue. So there's a lot of pressure going on. As I say, I mean, I think, you know, if you read a newspaper, you'll also understand that a lot of voters were still very concerned about immigration, numbers of people coming to the country, and there's a perception. So there is a bit of there's an explanation that needs to happen to educate people. But as I say, one of the issues, and the difficulty with being seen to change the definition of what a migrant actually is you could be accused of fiddling with statistics. But I think that, as I say, most people, if you ask them, do you think that students or you know, highly qualified staff come to university should be caught by the cap, I think if they stopped and thought about it, they would be very surprised that that is the case.
Good. Thank you.
Hello, Donna Kendall, Coventry University. You talked about private providers entering the market space. I think we're all very well aware of that policy. But you also followed that up with a potential review of the use of the term university. I wonder if you could expand on your thinking in relation to that statement.
Well, I mean, the people who have raised it with me have been the Church of England. I think a lot of the church colleges have to be called university colleges. They're not allowed to call them universities, and that's to do with the numbers of students they have studying there. So that's where, it's not only the church colleges have raised it particularly with me, but I think there are other people who are referred to as university colleges and who feel that actually they would like to be able to apply for the title university. And as I understand it, it's all about the numbers of, I think you've got to have over 4,000 students to be a university, and some of the church colleges are smaller than that, but they would like to be university. So that's where it's coming from. And when the response to the white paper is published, I think it will set out, you know, those people who have made representations and will ask for views from the rest of the sector on a view on what the way forward might be. Gentleman here.
Thanks. Neil Henderson, University of the Arts, London. Just sticking on the theme of privatisation, you mentioned about making it easier potentially for private providers to move into the sector. How would you ensure that maintaining the quality of the product, as it were? And also then a second part to that is then about, in employability terms, would a degree from a private provider be seen as a second-class qualification?
I think in terms of quality, I mean, that's where a body such as the QAA, and there's I didn't go through it, but in the white paper there's quite a lot of talk about changing the regulatory structure. What we don't want to do is invent a new body. We don't want any more quangos. So there would be the QAA would be involved, and also I think probably HEFCE in terms of ensuring the quality of courses. I mean, like, you know, the courses are audited in other universities. And in terms of employability, I mean, that's very much something for, I suppose, the students to judge very much. I mean, that's part of the thing about having this employability statistics and information so that students can judge sort of past graduates from each institution as to their employability and who's getting jobs and what sort of jobs they're getting. And that information hasn't really been so easily available. I suppose it would depend on the nature of the job that somebody was after, the type of sector they were going to go and work in, and also the type of private provider who came in, and whether they were being perceived, I mean, to offer the right high quality education amongst the student body and amongst employers. Because like any organisation or any group of people, students will swap stories, as will employers, and employers will have a view about degrees from X or Y and where they want to recruit people from. Do you want the microphone back?
I just worry about the capacity of organisations like the QAA to maintain those standards, given that at the moment is struggling to do it. So has any thought been given to that?
Well, I suspect they would need more resources, and that's part of the discussion going on about the regulatory framework that will be addressed when the white paper response is published. There's a gentleman at the back.
Hello, Dean Morley from Kingston. You mentioned with the white paper and some of the changes, core and margin, private providers, collaboration, alliances and mergers, and it wasn't, the desire wasn't a top-down change. But is there a view about actually 5 or 10 years' time what you would aspire the sector to look like? Even though you wouldn't necessarily control it from the top down, there must be some kind of view about how the shape may change.
I'm not sure there really is, to be honest with you. I mean, I'm sure if you as the ministers would obviously want, we want a continuing high quality, world class sector, offering the best student experience, and that obviously is now going to focus, we hope, as much on teaching as on research. But in terms of numbers of institutions or who's working with who, that's something very much for the sector to deliver. And I think it's important. I think often people outside the sector will think of the sector as being some sort of part of the public sector, part of government dictates who universities are going to admit or who they're going to work with, who they're going to collaborate with, and that's absolutely not where we want to go.
Hi, Simon Inger, University of Bath. I'm interested in the aspiration that this, the system of the future will rely on well-informed prospective students, and you talked about some things like ratemyprofessor.com, which I don't think any of my academic colleagues would consider good information for prospective students, and key information sets, of course, which are not without their critics in some elements. So what role do you think government has in helping prospective students, who are mostly school children, understand what questions to ask? You spoke about people doing simply the wrong A-levels, and it goes much earlier than that. It goes into GCSE and earlier, about setting people up for the right higher education experience. So what's in the air that's going to come from government to help future generations understand how they can get into higher education?
Well, I mean, it's partly about making sure that schools are very plugged in to higher education and in terms of advising. I mean, I mentioned the National Careers Service, and I think that is absolutely critical. And in terms of explaining, I mean, I think universities have a, I'm afraid I think universities have a big part to play in this. In terms, obviously, they're very involved in terms of widening participation. But I mean, what we did in order to explain the change in the funding was to get students or past students to go into schools and to explain. And to be very clear, to send out a lot of very clear information about the funding structures and the changes, so that people knew and parents were briefed as much as they could be on the changes in the sector. And I think government's role is very much to say, this is what we want to see in the key information sets. I mean, websites and things will spring up inevitably, and there is always going to be talk between students, future students, present students, past students, as to their experiences at university. But I think organisations like potentially Which, and making sure that there are good consumer organisations involved in providing that information. And as I say, it's interesting, and I'm sure you're right about things like the website that I mentioned about academic staff, being not being supportive or being worried about what was on there. And I guess that's probably put the question back, which is I'm imagining that's a role for you as HR professionals within the university sector to address with the academic staff and other staff, and just about university experiences. I guess it's also about working with students' unions and the NUS, again, to make sure that future students have the best possible information they can to make the judgments. But probably about talking about it, and you're right, it's before A-levels, it is GCSE level, and even before that, really, getting people to think about their future and where they're heading. So universities and schools have worked, they already work closely, but I think they're probably going to have to work even more closely in terms of guiding students and helping them to get access to the right, reliable information.
John Kempton, Institute of Cancer Research. We do a lot of work with business, joint collaborations, joint ventures. In all sectors, including the pharma sector, you mentioned money is tight. The HIFE money has been cash limited. We want to do more, and that's obviously on the government agenda. What's your thoughts about where that's going to go?
Well, the HIFE money, the science and research budget has been ring-fenced, and it is staying there in cash terms. You're right, there is less money around, and I suppose it's a question of making sure that the collaborations are working as well as they possibly can, and that research is not being, if not duplicated, that actually we're very clear about the research that's going on. And supporting. There are obviously there are other sources of funding. Things like the government has introduced. Obviously, there has already been the Technology Strategy Board, but there are the Technology Innovation Centres now, the Catapult Centres, and other. There are other funds available. So it's making sure that people are aware of that money. But it is out there. But I think the pharma sector in particular, and this is my constituency MP experience. The model is changing, and making those drug discoveries, and particularly the big blockbuster drug discoveries, they're not there anymore. And I think there's got to be a recognition also that there are these contract research organisations who will then work with the larger organisations to support their money. And the government launched last year its life sciences strategy, and that's about focusing on the life sciences as the sector in which Britain does very well, and supporting that to the best of our abilities.
Nicky, can I ask about pay policy? Obviously, the government's made its position on pay policy in the public sector and its encouragement for local pay bargaining quite clear. That doesn't directly affect this sector, but I just wondered if you had any thoughts or opinions or views about that issue as it affects us. It's obviously a big issue for HR professionals.
Yeah, I think obviously that we are at a time when there isn't lots of money. We have had to ask people in the public sector to exercise restraint, and I think we've also recommended, or HEFCE recommended that in their funding letter. In terms of local pay bargaining, the Chancellor was talking about last night, and it's they are the government is consulting, Treasury is consulting on local pay bargaining. But again, this is one of those areas where it is very much down to universities, and universities are autonomous institutions, and they've got to do the right thing. And I mentioned in my speech, and I was interested about whether there are going to be more teaching-only contracts, and whether there's going to be more what the relationship is going to be between academic staff and non-academic staff. And obviously the THE published recently again, I think, their list of vice-chancellors' salaries and benefits and everything else. I think more transparency can only be a good thing, and make it very clear what people are getting paid. Regional pay is something. It's up for consultation. It might be something that people find attractive. It may help in terms of recruitment, because there may be some parts of the country where actually getting people is harder, and therefore they get paid more. I think people look at it when they discuss it as in terms of salaries falling, and that might not always be the case. But I think we all have to be mindful of the public, the financial environment in which we're living. Is there a need back there?
Thank you. Vereen Johnson, Newcastle University. I was delighted to hear that you are familiar with Loughborough University and that you work closely. I guess when you talk about briefing, universities briefing their local MPs, that sounds very sensible. But it will often be about research or student experience issues. I would have thought rarely are you likely to be briefed on operational or HR practices. And there's just a sense for me that perhaps MPs aren't as aware as they might be of how the sector has changed and of the good practice which is actually going on. So I wondered whether you have ideas on how UHR or its members might help our MPs understand that.
I think you're absolutely right, and I do think that people who aren't involved in the sector often think about universities in very simple terms. You know, it's all about students going and being taught, and that's kind of it. They miss as I say, the other big fact that you are very important local employers, usually very large local employers, and also, I mean, in terms of you know, particularly HR related issues, I suspect if something is coming up at a university. I mean, it's amazing what constituency MPs get written, you know, to about, if that's probably not very good grammar, but you know, we get all sorts of things. So you know, if there was some sort of discussions going on about the local pay and conditions, you can bet your bottom dollar that somebody somewhere from a university would write to their local member of parliament about it. So that's where it's, you know, good to get in. I think in terms of, yeah, I mean, yeah, you know, I don't want to teach anyone to suck eggs, but I guess the briefing, simple briefing notes. You know, we hear a lot, and perhaps as part of my role, I hear a lot from Universities UK, I hear a lot from the University Alliance, I hear a lot from 1994 Group, NUS. But I think the impact in saying that universities are, you know, are large employers, and these are the issues affecting in terms of just balance of numbers of staff. It's interesting, you know, reading the statistics about actually how many non-academic staff universities now employ, and also part-time staff, and also the rise in female employment by universities. All those things, I think, you know, I'm quite keen to make sure that when people are discussing HE in the House of Commons, it's not all about money. It's also about the contribution in the widest possible sense that universities, both staff and students, make to their local area. So the more, but with a member of parliament, I probably get 150 emails a day. So if you're going to send me something, either send it to me you know, via a local person, because they're a constituent. I will sit up and immediately listen. So anyone my constituents who might be here, Simon's probably the only one. So that's one way of getting attention. Or alternatively, just a quick, short, pithy briefing note on a particular sort of, you know, issue or topic of concern, just so it goes in the back of the mind for when it's actually raised, or the opportunity to mention it in the House of Commons is absolutely invaluable. Somebody down here. It is coming.
Bethan Edwards, University of Wales, Newport. I was interested in your comments that there's no top-down strategy from government on higher education, and recognising that universities are autonomous institutions. And I'd be interested in your views on the impact of devolution on higher education, particularly in Scotland and Wales. And certainly in Wales, the minister's view that he wishes to see less universities and is prepared to dissolve universities to get to that point.
Well, I mean, I think you know, that is one of the things about devolution, is that, and we certainly found in terms of discussing funding, you know, there's been a lot of unhappiness, I think, in the media and amongst you know, constituents and voters about the differential in fees between England and Scotland in particular. And I would, you know, you can quote this back at me should anyone ever say it, but I'd be very surprised to hear an English minister ever saying something like that. I mean, it's very much so. I think that the thing about devolution is that you know, I don't represent a constituency in a devolved administration, but that does mean that people run things in a very different way. And so I think as a university sector, you're having to deal with sort of the impact of two governments' policies. But as a political settlement, we are where we are, and I'm sorry that I can't get anything more concrete than that. But I think, you know, we do have a strategy, but it is very much in England about that universities are autonomous, independent, and they are masters of their own destiny, working with government, in some policy areas. But clearly, the Welsh Minister might have a different view on that. Oh, one last one here.
Hi, I'm Kerry Eustace from The Guardian's Higher Education Network. I just wanted to pick up on the point about schools and universities working together. Could you give us a flavour of how you, David, and that department work with Michael Gove and their department? I think,
probably the most recent thing has been about emissions and about talking about emissions procedures and looking, and also it's about widening participation. So I think a lot of the time it's about, again, it very much depends. Each university tends to do widening participation differently in a way that best suits them, but about being aware of the links. I mean, obviously, as members of Parliament, we all get to go into our local schools and talk, and actually schools, elsewhere. I mean, David will do speeches to other schools about the importance of HE policy. But we work obviously with Department for Education, Michael Gove. We work with Department of Health, Andrew Lansley, because of the medical schools and dental schools. So I think one of the things is, I'd like to think this government is all about is better at cross-departmental working and realising that you can't have everything, things like, well, lots of policies, but let's take HE, cannot be operated on a silo basis. But recognising that schools themselves are their own institutions and making sure that schools, and when the funding issues came up and the changes, we made sure that members of Parliament were as briefed as they possibly could be, so that if they did go into schools, that they had all the facts, that they were able to then explain the new funding system to particularly to sixth formers, but also those below. But it's a bit of an iterative process. I can't, David and Michael will talk, very, very regularly.